Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Story Time with Uncle Monkey. I am your Uncle Monkey, and today's story is The Six Swans. A king was once hunting in a great forest, pursuing a roe deer so zealously that none of his attendants was able to follow him. When evening came, he halted and looked all around. Then he realized he was lost. He sought a way out but couldn't find any. Then he saw an old woman with a shaking head coming toward him, but he was worried she might be a witch.
Dear lady,
He said to her,
can you show me the way out of the woods?
"Oh, yes, your majesty," she replied. "I certainly can, but there's a condition attached. If you don't meet it, you'll never get out of the forest and you'll starve here."
What is the condition?
The king asked. "I have a daughter who is so beautiful there's none other like her in the whole world, and she certainly deserves to be your wife. If you agree to make her your queen, I'll show you the way out of the woods." In his anguish of heart, the king consented, and the old woman led him to her little house, where her daughter was sitting by the fire. The daughter welcomed the king as if she had been expecting him, and he saw that she was indeed very beautiful. But all the same, he didn't like her, and he couldn't look at her without feeling a secret dread. After he had lifted the girl onto his horse behind him, the old woman showed him the way out of the woods, and the king arrived back at the royal palace, where the wedding was celebrated. The king had already been married once before, and he had 7 children by his first wife, 6 boys and 1 girl. He loved them better than anything in the whole world. Because he now feared that their stepmother might mistreat them and even do them some injury, he brought them to a solitary mansion that stood at the center of another forest. It was so secluded, and the path to it was so hard to find, that he himself wouldn't have found it if a wise woman hadn't once given him a magical ball of yarn. When he threw it in front of him, it unrolled by itself and showed the king the way. But the king went out to see his beloved children so often that the queen noticed his absence. She became curious and wanted to know what business he had all alone out in the woods. She gave a large amount of money to one of his servants, who betrayed his secret to her, also telling her about the magical yarn, which was the only thing that could show the way. Now the queen couldn't rest until she discovered where the king kept the yarn. Then she made little shirts of white silk, and since she had learned evil magic from her mother, she sewed a spell into the shirts. And when the king rode out hunting one day, she took the little shirts and entered the forest, the yarn showing her the way. The children, seeing someone coming in the distance, thought their dear father was visiting them and dashed out to meet him full of joy. Then she threw one of the little shirts over each one of the children, and the moment the shirts touched their bodies, they were transformed into swans and flew away over the woods. Fully satisfied, the queen returned home, believing she was rid of her stepchildren. But the girl hadn't run out to greet her along with her brothers, and the queen knew nothing about the little girl. The next day the king came intending to visit his children and found no one but his daughter.
Where are your brothers?
The king asked. "Oh, father dear," she replied, "they're gone and they've left me all alone here." She told him what she had watched from her little window, how her brothers had flown away over the forest in the shape of swans. And then she showed her father a bunch of feathers that she had gathered up in the courtyard that were left by the brothers. The king was sad, but he didn't think that the queen had done that evil deed, and because he was afraid that the girl would be stolen from him too, he wanted to take her home along with him. But the daughter was afraid of her stepmother and begged the king to let her stay in the forest mansion just for that night. The poor girl thought to herself, "I can't stay here any longer. I want to go and look for my brothers." And when night came, she escaped, heading straight into the woods. She walked all night and the next day as well, until she was so tired she couldn't go on. Then she saw a rustic cabin, climbed the front stairs, and found a room with 6 little beds. But she didn't dare lie down on one of them. Instead, she crept under one of the beds and lay down on the hard floor, intending to spend the night there. But when the sun was close to setting, she heard a fluttering and saw 6 swans fly in through the window. They alighted on the floor and blew on one another, blowing off all their feathers, and their swan skins slipped off like a shirt. The girl looked at them and recognized her brothers. In her happiness, she crept out from under the bed. Her brothers were no less joyful at catching sight of their young sister, but their joy was brief in duration. "You can't stay here," they said to her. "It's a den of thieves, and if they come home and find you, they'll murder you." "Can't you protect me?" their sister asked. "No," they replied, "because we can strip off our swan skins and go about as human beings for only 15 minutes every evening, and then we turn back into swans again." Their sister wept and said, "Can't you be delivered from the spell?" "Oh, no," they replied. "The necessary conditions are too hard to meet. For 6 years, sister, you mustn't speak. And during that time, you must sew us 6 little shirts out of asters. Those are flowers. If just one word comes out of your mouth, all the work will have been wasted." And when the brothers had said that, the 15 minutes were up, and they flew out the window again as swans. But the girl made a firm decision to deliver her brothers, even if it cost her her life. She left the cabin, walked deep into the woods, and sat down up in a tree on a bough. And she spent the night there. The next morning she went out, picked asters, and began sewing. She couldn't talk to anyone, and she didn't feel like laughing. She sat there with her eyes glued to her work. After she had spent quite some time there, it came about that the king of another country was hunting in the forest, and his huntsmen came to the tree where the girl was sitting. They called to her, saying, "Who are you?" But she made no reply. "Come on down to us," they said. "We won't harm you." She merely shook her head. When they besieged her with more questions, she threw her golden necklace down to them, thinking that she'd pacify them that way. But they didn't let up. So she threw down her belt, and when that didn't do any good, her garters, and gradually everything she had on and could get along without, until she kept nothing more than her little shift. But the hunters wouldn't be put off that way. They climbed the tree and brought the girl down and led her to their king. The king said, "Who are you? What were you doing in that tree?" But she didn't answer. He asked her in every language that he knew, but she remained as mute as a fish. But because she was so beautiful, the king's heart was touched, and he conceived a great love for her. He placed his cloak around her, sat her in front of him on his horse, and brought her to his palace. There he had her dressed in rich garments, and she beamed in her beauty like bright sunshine, but no one could get a word out of her. He placed her beside him at the table, and her modest ways and good behavior pleased him so much that he said, "This woman I desire to wed, and none other in the world." A few days later, he married her. But the king had a wicked mother who was dissatisfied with his marriage and spoke ill of the young queen. "Who knows where the peasant girl comes from?" she said. "She can't even talk. She isn't worthy of a king." A year later, when the queen, the little girl, gave birth to her first child, the king's mother took it away from her and smeared her mouth with blood while she was sleeping. Then she went to the king and accused her of being a cannibal. The king refused to believe such nonsense and wouldn't allow any harm to be done to his wife. But the queen, the little girl, she steadfastly sat sewing the shirts and paid no mind to anything else. The next time, after she became the mother of a lovely little boy, her treacherous mother-in-law played the same trick. But again, the king couldn't bring himself to lend credence to her report. He said, She's too decent and too kind to do a thing like that. If she could but speak to defend herself, her innocence would be made public. But after the old woman had stolen a third newborn child, making an accusation against the queen again, who uttered not a single word in her defense, the king had no other choice but to hand her over for trial, and she was sentenced to suffer death by burning for eating her 3 children. When the day came on which the sentence was to be carried out, it was the same day that concluded the 6 years during which she couldn't speak or laugh or make any noises at all. And she had delivered her beloved brothers from the power of the spell. She had completed the 6 shirts. Only the left sleeve was still missing on the last one. It was good enough, though. Now, when she was led to the pyre, she placed the shirts over her arm, and when she was standing atop it and the fire was just about to be lit, she looked behind her, and there she saw the 6 swans flying in, and they landed. When she saw that their deliverance was near, her heart jumped for joy. The swans fluttered over to her and alighted so she could throw the shirts over them. And the moment they were touched by these shirts made out of the asters, their swan skins fell off, and her brothers were standing before her in their own bodies, looking energetic and handsome. Only the youngest one was missing his left arm. Instead, he had a swan's wing on his back. They hugged and kissed, and the queen went to the king, who was completely astounded. And she spoke to her husband for the first time, saying, "Dearest husband, now I may speak and inform you that I am innocent and wrongly accused by your mother." And she told him about the deceitful ways of the old woman, who had taken her 3 children and hidden them, and then smeared her face with blood. Then, to the king's great joy, they were brought out of concealment. And as punishment, the wicked mother-in-law was tied to the stake and burned to ashes. But the king and queen, their 3 children, and the queen's 6 brothers lived a long life in happiness and peace. The end.